Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Unplugged. Friday, those of us here at CBS and countless others around the world mourn the loss of Walter Cronkite, who became known as the most trusted man in America. Joining me to talk about it is Howard Kurtz, who writes about television and the media for the Washington Post. Howard, thank you so much for coming this morning.
Sure,
and
Bob.
I want to just ask you this. Do you think there can ever be another Walter Cronkite?
I don't, for a number of reasons, Bob. And part of it, of course, has to do with the era in which he ruled television, when there were essentially two network news divisions worth talking about, CBS and NBC. And now, of course, you have 1,000 cable channels and all of that. But even more so, can you imagine a journalist today being called the most trusted man in America? We just live in a more cynical time. The news business is not trusted by great majorities of Americans, and a lot of that has to do with self-inflicted wounds by people in our business. And we have, cable channels and websites devoted from the left and the right to beating up on the media every day, every minute, every hour, in a way that I think has just depressed public esteem for this business. So no matter how good an anchor is today, no matter how popular, no matter how experienced, I don't think he could ever achieve a Cronkite-like status.
We do live, as you say, in this era of opinion journalism, and the thing that always brought credibility to Walter Cronkite, in my opinion, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, is that because he so seldom expressed an opinion, when he did, people really took it seriously, and they came away feeling, Walter must have given this some thought before he said what he just said.
Right. I mean, of course, the most famous example is probably when he took his trip to Vietnam in 1968 and came back. And even then, he wasn't on a soapbox about the war. He was giving his journalistic assessment that it appeared to be a stalemate. And of course, he was right. And that had a big impact, I think, on public opinion. But, Walter Cronkite and CBS at that time also had the luxury of, as television became the dominant medium for news, shifting the balance away from newspapers, they didn't have to worry about cable television channels or websites that were providing news all day. People actually, sat down for dinner at 6:30 and turned on either Huntley and Brinkley or Cronkite's evening news. And so he could afford to do a very straight newscast based around the headlines and the correspondence. They always announced, and Marvin Kalb was in London and Eric Severide in Washington and that sort of thing. Because many people didn't have computers. They didn't know the news. And now, of course, the feeling is by the time you come on at 6:30 or 7 at night, people know the headlines. You've got to do something else, which is more in the nature of analysis, trend stories, and feature stories.
Something else that Walter brought to it, I think, is that Walter understood that there wasn't any news happening in the newsroom. And he knew the news was happening out there where the reporters were. And that's why we like to work for him so much. He knew we were the ones that had the news, and he would make sure on his broadcast that the news came first. And sometimes as I look at some of the things that are held up as a newscast these days, you think, they might learn something from Walter Cronkite on that front. But it's a very different world.
Yeah, well, certainly personality and flashiness loom a lot larger in today's media universe. And, I think part of the success of the CBS Evening News, and clearly Cronkite deserves the lion's share of it, was, that murderer's row, that bench of correspondents, which included you in the 60s and 70s, as well as the likes of Dan Rather, Marvin Kalb, Bernard Kalb, and others at that time, and Roger Mudd, of course. And they were played up. They had starring roles, and Cronkite would often toss to them. So, I've heard you make the observation that the newscast wasn't about Walter. Well, he, of course, was the voice of authority. He was the traffic cop. But he also was the guy who spotlighted his correspondents who actually went out and gathered the news.
I think that's exactly right, Howard. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for being with us here to share some stories about the best that ever was.
Thanks so much.
And with us now is former CBS News correspondent Marvin Kalb. He worked alongside Walter Cronkite for over 20 years. And Marvin, you were one of those who worked not just with Walter Cronkite, but also, before that, with Ed Murrah.
Yeah.
Give me a little sense of how they were alike and how they were different.
They were both complete journalists. Very curious, very much involved in every story they did. But when the program was over, there were huge differences between the two men. Cronkite was the sort of guy who, with the program behind him, did not mind going out with friends, having a joyous, raucous dinner. If he was up on the Cape, going on his boat. I was once on a boat with him in the harbor at Martha's Vineyard, and he would go by there like an admiral. Everybody sort of brought their boats off to one side or another and waved at him, "Hi there, Walter, how you doing?" And he loved that. Cronkite was that sort of total human being. Morrow carried the weight of the world on his shoulders at all times. When he was finished with the broadcast, he still worried about what he had just said. Not in terms of the quality of the broadcast, but the issue. If it was the Middle East, what are we going to do? If it was dealing with Russia, nuclear weapons. He was the kind of guy who would invite you to a drink after dinner and then agonize so deeply. Quite often, I was thrilled to be with him, if asked. But at the same time, when I left, I would say, doesn't he ease up ever?
Yeah. That's a very, very interesting comparison. I want to ask you about something else, and I know how it was working here in this Washington bureau when, you know, you were over at the State Department, Roger Mudd was up on Capitol Hill, Dan Shore was getting into everybody's business, covering every beat, and Dan Rather was there, of course. It really was. I mean, it was the kind of bureau that we haven't seen since, and I don't think we'd seen anything like it before that. But the thing that we all loved, and I remember, is that if you had a story and it was news, Walter Cronkite would figure out how to get it on the broadcast.
I tell you, I don't think I did this more in all those years, more than maybe a half dozen times, probably fewer than that. But if I had a story that I thought was terribly important, I could call Walter up until 6:20, 10 minutes before air, and say, Walter, and by the way, get through all of the producers and get to the anchorman, and say, Walter, this is what I've just learned. And he'd think it would be about maybe a 2 or 3 second pause, and then he would say something like, type up that story, give it to me, I'll credit you on air, or, rarely, but he did it, give me 45 seconds on that, you're at the top of the show, let's go. And, you know, it would be so exciting. First of all, you had access to the anchor. Walter was always there.
Yeah.
Now, Bob, you've been an anchor, and you know how rare that is, because the show kind of gets locked up, and that's it. But Cronkite would tear the show apart if he thought there was a justifiable story. I think if you did it too often, I think if you really didn't have a justifiable lead story, I think he wouldn't take your call. But if you were among that group, you were there, I think I was, and a couple of the others, he was the best anchor, I think, I've ever worked with.
Well, exactly right, and it goes back to the point that I've made a couple of times over the last couple of days. Walter didn't let anything get in front of the news. He put the news first. Nothing came ahead of the news, including Walter Cronkite.
Exactly.
Okay, Marvin Kalb. Thank you, Marvin, for sharing those wonderful stories with us today. Finally, to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Apollo 11's moon landing, we're going to leave you with some thoughts from, who else? Walter Cronkite about that historic night. This is Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Schieffer.
Never has there been before, nor will there be, anything like this pioneering adventure. The landing on the moon presented an interesting emotional challenge for me. I had just as much time to prepare for that landing as the space program did.
30 seconds.
I'd watched it from the beginning.
30 feet, 2.5 down. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Oh, boy. And yet, when that vehicle landed on the moon, I was speechless.
Boy.
Okay, we're going to be busy.
I really couldn't say a thing.
Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American standing on the surface of the moon.
I mean, at a time when there were a lot of other problems in this country and elsewhere, people were downcast. everybody there was upcast. We were looking toward the stars, looking toward the moon.